Welcome to Unite Now, where we bring unity to you, wherever you are.
So let's kick off. Welcome everybody to Meet the Devs on the new input system. I'm Will Goldstone. I'm product lead for workflow here at Unity. And I'm going to hand over to the other two guys to introduce themselves in a moment. But first, I'm just going to show you the agenda that we're going to do today. So I'm just going to share my screen and do that. Da-da-da. Okay, so this, like I said, is Meet the Devs as part of our Unite Now programming. And today we're going to have a quick introduction. So we're going to meet the team. I'll be introducing you to Andy and Rene, our developer. And then Rene's going to give you a quick breakdown of the new input system, the kind of the what and the why. And then Andy's going to show you a live in-editor demo of how you do a few things with this new system. And then we're going to throw it over back to you to give us a good set of questions. So just bring us all of your awkward questions like, you know, does the new input system support the Nintendo Power Glove or Nintendo Zapper, for example? Or, you know, just more easy questions like what's the compatibility with docks or something like that. So without further ado, this is the team. Like I said, I'm Will, and I'll throw you over to Rene to introduce himself. So I'm going to stop my share right now so you can see Rene.
Right. So I'm Rene Damm. I'm the input team lead and main code monkey on the input system. And have been for a while. Andy?
Cool. Andy?
My name is Andy Touch. I'm based here in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and I'm on the evangelism team building content, demos, examples, projects, and helping people to learn Unity and new features. And one that I've been focused on a lot on recently is input.
Great. So speaking of which, let's just have a quick rundown of where we are, why we've gotten to where we are with input, and what we're kind of replacing. So we talk about this being the new input system. So I think it's kind of useful for us to be able to say, oh, it says sound gone, getting people saying that our audio is broken down for some reason. Okay, someone else says they can hear us. Okay, great. Well, we're going to continue and assume that everything is good. Yes, so Rene, I'm going to throw it over to you. So we had the input system for the longest time. We now have a new system. What's the big difference, and why have we developed this system?
Well, I think it's no secret that when it comes to input, like we, with respect to the old system, we fallen behind quite a bit. Like the old system dates back to quite a while back now, when like Gamepad and mouse and keyboard, that was pretty much the dominant form of input. Touch wasn't even like really on the horizon. So everything that came after that was a bit of an afterthought. Like we've been moving pretty slow in the space. So this is kind of to finally get us to a point where we have something modern in place that really like, goes across all platforms and all across like the various devices, the various needs and use cases that we have now. Also with a pretty rapidly accelerating pace in the XR space. And all the stuff that happens with input there, which is finally really breathing some new wind into the whole sector. So yeah, like there was a lot that needed to be done, and with the new input system, we're finally getting to the point where we're starting to address the needs that have emerged over that pretty long period of Unity being out there.
Awesome. And what were some of the kind of big missing things from the old system, if people aren't that familiar with that?
There, like for example, like there was a lot of variety between platforms and not a lot of standardization, even to the point where you could have a Gamepad, you plug it in on Mac and plug it in on Windows, it looks completely different. So you had to account for a lot of differences between platforms, which is ironic because Unity has kind of like always prided itself on like making it easy to go from platform to platform. Then like all the various means of input that came out in very wildly different ways. So like touch was completely separate from mouse and keyboard input. Joystick input kind of came in through the same path, but it was sort of jammed in there. So there was not a lot of consistency. And then like a lot of things that were just plain not possible. Like it was sitting all locked away in native. You couldn't feed in your own input. You could not create your own, like support for your own devices and that kind of stuff. And Yeah, even to the point where you couldn't even rebind things dynamically at runtime. These kind of things.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, I remember spending a lot of time Googling what our bindings were for an Xbox 360 controller, and being like, oh, this is input 28. Oh, cool, that's the X button. So yeah, we're obviously solving a lot of those problems.
I think everyone has, oh, sorry. I think everyone has
Okay.
that one graphic image from Google, which is like, this is I've seen in so many studios, they printed it and put it on the wall, the Xbox mapping thing. And so we cool that this is being looked at. Yeah.
Yeah, Connor B says, yes, I have that Xbox ref saved. Exactly. I think we all do. So we've put pay to that, or Rene, you've put pay to that, so thank you. So I think the next thing to do is to really dive in and take a look at the system. So Andy, tell us a little bit about what we're going to see from you today in this demo.
Yeah, absolutely. So a project I worked on recently is a kind of example project that covers a wide variety of common scenarios to do with input. So this can be everything from mapping a joystick to a movement of a character, which is often the kind of core fundamental of most games that a lot of people make, especially 3D games, all the way through to switching bindings based on if you're playing the game on a keyboard or a controller, such as I don't have anything fancy like Will, but a PlayStation 4 controller, Xbox controller, things like this. All the way through to, what about a touchscreen? Touchscreen doesn't have joysticks, so how does this work with a virtual joystick? And it covers a couple of other areas, such as debugging input. So again, that reference sheet, so there's actually now tools inside the new input system that allows you to preview the devices connected. And there's a couple of other really neat tools and tricks and features, kind of things that before I joined Unity, like 7 years ago, I kind of wish I really had then. I wish I have a time machine to take this package back in time now and show it to myself, pulling out less hair. But a lot of these elements are now in. And this demo project, which is available now on GitHub, and we'll share a link at the end, kind of covers a lot of those core foundational features, all the way through to like remapping of UI. So you can change a X button to a trigger button for an attack.
Cool. And so that people can kind of prepare for when they get that link and download the project, what version of Unity should they be opening that in?
So the master branch of the project, it's a GitHub repository, is on 2019.3 or 2019.3.7 to be exact. But it should generally work across the latest 2019.3 versions. But I've also created a branch for 2020.1 beta. And I think it's beta 4, the branch, but I'm going to keep these kind of in parallel so that a lot of people that download the project beyond 2019.3, and eventually when 2020.1 becomes out of beta and like the F release or the release candidate release, I can then upgrade that and kind of almost swap them over. So those people who like to jump ahead a little bit and experiment with 2020.1 and the betas, there's a branch for that, but the main one's 19.3. And I'll show the 19.3 one as well.
Yeah, totally. So people can go and start their download in the Unity Hub now and be totally ready to load up your project when they get the link. Yes. Cool. Okay, let's take a look, man.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump over to and share my screen.
Just while Andy does that, just a quick reminder to everybody, we are taking questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. You can also fire your questions onto the forum. It's more likely we'll get to the forum questions after the webinar. So if you've got questions now, feel free to ask them as we go, and we'll kind of track those whilst Andy is presenting to you all.
So I'm sharing my screen now, so hopefully everyone can see a very handsome warrior standing in the middle of the screen. I guess Will can let me know because
I can see it. I think it looks great. So go for it.
Yeah, clearly modeled after your facial hair, Will. So here I have a character. And on this character, if I enter play mode, like most people would, he has some very simple movement. So using my keyboard keys, WASD, he's running around in X and Z axis. And when I hit spacebar, he's going to have a simple attack. So this is kind of two very simple inputs, one being axis-based and one being button-based. You push a button, something happens. You push a direction, and the vector 3 gets converted into a direction. So this is very, very simple sort of setup with this Warriors project. Now, this is currently using right now the old input manager. And in this project, I've tried to include both the old input manager code and the new input system code simultaneously. So you can kind of see differences and comparisons with a joystick and joystick axis movement and also a button press. So if I leave play mode now and go over to the package manager, let's see how we can take it from this simple movement like this and actually use the new input system and create a new control scheme for the Warrior and use a lot of benefits that the new input system comes with it. So if I go over to Package Manager, I've already done this step early and installed the input system package. We're using the Package Manager to distribute projects and distribute features and also distribute projects to come with them. And you'll notice with the input system, we have here lots of different samples to go with. So some of these are like editor window demo, in-game hints, input recorder, on-screen controls, and there's a whole wide variety to kind of cover a lot of core elements of a typical game's input system. I'm actually using one of these, and that's rebinding UI, which is actually inside this project, because it's something that a lot of people are asking about and they're curious about. And it was a big bugbear in the old input managers, but with the new input system, it's a lot easier, and this project demonstrates how to do this. So with this package manager input system package installed, you can then start using the new input system. Now, one thing you might have to do is underneath the project settings is locate other settings, and there'll be an option which is active input handling. You can choose the input manager old, input system new, or both. And I've included both to show the API for the old system and the new system. So if I go back to here, now we've got this set up, let's actually start. Now, one of the things that the input system brings is a new asset that you can create, which stores input actions. And this is basically creatable from the project asset creation window. You notice it's nested here or set here as input actions. And when you create one of those, you can double click it and it opens up a new contextual window. Kind of like if you created a shader graph or a VFX graph, or say an animation controller for the animator system. The input system is very similar, where you have this asset which holds a UI that allows you to kind of sculpt and create your player controls. So if I now jump over to this window and go through it, I'm going to set up this Warrior's action maps, actions, and bindings. So here for the Warrior and it's the input actions, there are 3 columns: action maps, actions, and properties. And all of these relate to one another. Action maps are kind of like control sets. So if you think of a typical open world game, let's say Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption or something like this, you would have different control sets for different scenarios. For example, you'd have one for third-person movement. So you have a joystick to run around, perhaps a button does jump. Then you'd perhaps have a control scheme for riding a horse, driving a car, where a joystick is going to operate very differently in the movement. And the A button is going to be, say, accelerate for a car. And then maybe you have also a pause menu or some kind of inventory selection. The joystick's not going to be movement, but it's instead going to choose different items or different weapons and things like this. And A is going to be a confirmation. So with these action maps, you can create multiple of them. Currently, I just have one for the player controls for this Warrior, but you can create multiple action maps and through a very simple API, switch between them at runtime. Now for this editor demo, I'm just going to have this one player controls for this Warrior. But when you download the project, there'll be one for a simple menu toggle to turn on and off a pause menu. And I'm going to look into adding some more options in the future. So under this action map, we have 2 actions: movement and attack. And these are very abstract. So notice that these aren't saying, you know, space bar, joystick, and things like this. The way that the input system works is you create these actions and then you assign multiple bindings to them for different forms of devices and platforms. So for movement, because our Warrior moves around using an axis, you notice here with it selected, the properties have some options. So we can choose a movement type. So we want to, action type is a value, because a joystick is not really a button. It's not a pass-through. It's going to return a value. And control type is kind of what type of value it's going to return. Is it going to be an axis? Is it going to be an analog? In this case, it's going to return a vector 2, X and Y of the joystick. Now, if I go to attack, that's going to be a button because we want to push X or push spacebar or push a trigger or tap a screen to be able to attack. So it's just going to be a button action. Now, for movement, what I can do is I can click this little plus and I can add a binding or a 2D vector composite. And if I create the 2D vector composite, it's going to create a 2D vector with up, down, left, and right, which is basically going to replicate kind of like a joystick or an axis. I'm going to call this WAST keys. You can name your bindings anything you want, but this one's the most accurate for real gamers or true gamers out there. And for each of these bindings, I can then choose a path or what up corresponds to. Now, if I select this path and open this option up, we get a very long list, and I'm not going to go through every single option, of all the different types of bindings or different types of inputs that you can set up. You'll notice there's some common familiar ones: gamepad, joystick, keyboard, mouse. There's also a couple of other options such as pen, sensor, XR controller, XR HMD, other even, and you get kind of quite a lot of variety straight out of the box. Now, I haven't installed, like an Xbox SDK or a Nintendo Switch SDK or something like this, or anything to do with, Vive or other XR platforms. A lot of these settings, a lot of these tools are already come with that package. So if I go to Gamepad, you'll notice that there's options for Android Gamepad, iOS, PS4. This stuff all comes with the package. So obviously, I want to set this up for keyboard input. So I'm going to go to keyboards and notice that we then get a very long list, or I can choose any key. So I get a very long list of basically every key on the keyboard. Now, I only want very specific things. So I can instead actually just type into this keyboard and it will filter by that search. So I'm going to say, go to up is W, down is S. To save time, you can also click this little listen button. And what this is going to do is it's going to listen out for any key that I push. So instead of cycling through that list or searching, I can instead just hit, right, left is the A key, and I can set that up. So if I go through here and set this all up, I've now got WASD, up, down, left, right. And that's all I need to do for this movement binding. I'll come back to it a bit later on. And what you also notice for these bindings is you get this control scheme. So here I have a keyboard. You could set up different control schemes for different types of things like gamepad, XR controllers, and things like this. So these are all going to be set up with the keyboard control scheme, which you can switch later on an asset I'll show you in a bit. Now let's set up attack. So if I click attack and click that little plus option, now instead of doing a 2D vector composite, which is for a joystick, I'm instead just going to do a binding. And this also has a path. And what I want to do is I want to bind this to E. So E is going to be attack. And this is also part of the keyboard. So now I've got these two actions, movement and attack. And of course, I could create a lot more actions. And movement is bound to WASD, and attack is bound to a keyboard. After I've done setting this up, I can click Save Asset, just like you would with shader graph or a VFX graph or kind of most other contextual assets that hold hold some data that you then use. And this asset is then ready to use in the project for the warrior. Now, if I select the warrior, what you'll notice is that we have this player input component. And the player input component is kind of like an instance of this asset. So with the player input component, think of something like an audio asset, an audio clip asset. And you have an audio source which kind of takes that audio clip and instances it inside the world. Now, when it instances in the world, it's then going to take that clip and then play it or do something with it. Similar to do with a animation controller being played by an animated component in the world as well, or in the scene as well. And the player input is very similar to this. So if I enable this, I can then choose which type of action set or which type of action asset to use, because you can create multiple of them. So I'm going to assign the warrior. I can choose which default scheme to use, so any or keyboard. I get a couple of other options, which I'm not going to use. But one of the most interesting things here is that the behavior is going to be defined on what you're going to actually do with these actions. So we set up the actions movement and attack. What you'll notice here is if behavior is set to send messages, we get a couple of messages which are going to be sent locally to this object and its various scripts. We get some built-in stuff like on-device lost, on-device regained, controls changed, things like that. We've also got on movement and on attack based on these action names. So if I set up another one, say jump, it's going to add on jump as well. Now, if, like me, you're a little scared of the send message, you can also change this to be broadcast, invoke Unity events, invoke C# events. So if I just switch over to Unity events, what you'll notice is that we get Unity events to be able to bind callbacks to each of these different things. So movement will then fire off on this method on this particular script. Now for this demo, I'm just going to use send messages because it's very straightforward and that's how I've set it up. But you can obviously go in and change this however you want, especially when you set up your own games and systems. So now that I've got this set up, so on movement, on attack, I'm just going to go to this player controller script and turn off this use old input manager. And I'm now going to go in and have a look to see what this script actually does. I won't read through everything here, but if I go down to these two methods here, calculate movement inputs and calculate attack inputs, I've wrapped them in a Boolean for use old input manager. And the old input manager's usage for movement is pretty straightforward. It's basically going to get the get axis raw vertical, get axis raw horizontal. If you've written any input code in Unity using the old input manager, you're probably very familiar with this. And it's going to take these two values, construct a new vector 3, and pass them to input direction to then be used later on, to be used to move the character in a certain direction. And calculate attack input is very similar as well. It just has if input.getKeyDown, spacebar, then it plays that animation. Both really straightforward, very simple things. Now, obviously, with that Boolean turned off, I can scroll down to the bottom and have a look to see what the new input system code does and how it differs. So notice I had those two callbacks that were visible in the player input on movement and on attack. Well, these are now here. These are now callbacks I can then use and use their data. So on movement, you can then get the value of vector 2, because remember we set up vector 2 in the property for movement. And now I'm basically taking the axis result and then passing it back into input direction, just like I did with the old input manager. On attack is even simpler. It basically just takes that value of on attack, detects it's a button, and it just plays the animation. Now this is obviously a much simpler sort of entry-level example, but I really wanted to show like a really simple example of the old input manager code and the new input system code. And there's obviously a lot more use cases and scenarios that you can run into a bit later on, but this is kind of like the core fundamental for a simple movement action system that this demo has. So if I now go back, check that everything's set up. So I've got my warrior, got the player input component, got the input action asset, it's sending the messages, and I have old input manager turned off. And if I click play, what you'll notice is that the warrior is running and animating. I can push my arrow keys, WASD, and I can hit space, I can hit E even, it wasn't spacebar, and he attacks. So it basically looks almost identical to what I had before, but this is now using the new input system with this visual inspector. I didn't actually have to write really that much code, just a few lines, and most of the actual binding setup to do with setting up to the keyboard is all done in this interface. Now, one thing you'll notice is that this warrior has a little UI floating above its head in world space, showing number 1, showing it's one warrior that spawned to the scene, and it has basically the input device connected to it, which is keyboard. So it's displaying input values from the input system. And if you look over here into the player input component here, we've got some debug values at runtime. We have user, which is 0. I've shifted the integers up 1, so obviously games usually have player 1, 2, 3, 4, not player 0, 1, 2, 3. We've got the control scheme we're using, keyboard, and we also got devices, in this case, a keyboard. And this data will change depending on what type of device is connected to that player input and that input actions. And all I've done is I've just written some visual display code that takes that debug data and then presents it dynamically in this UI. So I figured I'd add this to the project just to show how you could use that data, but also present it in your game in some form. I've seen a lot of games that have, player 1, player 2, player 3, but it might also be useful in some menu settings to show what type of device is currently connected. So we have a character running around like this. Now this all works and this is all super cool. And you're probably thinking, great, you're back to basically where you were like 5 to 10 minutes ago. And what I want to do now is kind of now build on top of this control scheme and add a couple more new fun features that the new input system gives you. So if I go back to this window, let's set up another control scheme. In this case, this one's going to be for gamepads. You can name these control schemes anything you want. So maybe you have like a Steam control scheme, or you have a control scheme for a conference demo or different platforms. It's really up to you. In this case, I'm calling it gamepads. And I'm going to add the gamepad list. So now that I've created this gamepads list, one thing you might notice is that movement and attack have lost their bindings. But they haven't actually lost their bindings. They haven't disappeared anywhere. As I'm filtering this control scheme by gamepads, it's not going to display those to do with keyboard. So if I switch that filter back to keyboard, it's going to show these bindings accordingly. And if I switch to gamepads, it's going to have the same actions because our warrior still with a gamepad has movement and attack. Just it's going to have very different types of bindings. I can, of course, choose all control schemes and show kind of keyboard, gamepads, and all these different bindings in one location. So let's set this up to work with a PlayStation 4 controller. So I have a PlayStation 4 controller just here, like so. I've also got an Xbox controller and a couple of other devices with me. And on a PlayStation 4 controller, we have a couple of joysticks, but we also have joysticks on an Xbox controller, Nintendo Switch controller, and actually most general controllers have some kind of left joystick or some main joystick. And what we want to do is we want to set up movement to not just work with a PlayStation controller or Xbox controller. We want it to be very general, very generic, work with kind of all controller joysticks. We can do that quite easily without even touching the code. So if I go to movement here, I'm going to add a new binding because we can actually add multiple bindings to an action. And on this binding, I'm going to choose gamepad. Now, I could go into these options. So I could go to PS4 controller and choose one of these. I could go to Switch controller and set up bindings for each platform. But instead, I'm going to go to this generic list at the top and just choose left stick. What you'll notice here is it says left stick gamepad. It's going to work for the left stick for any gamepad that we support. Now, if I go to attack, this is a button. This one's much easier. I want to add a new binding for attack. And let's do this to, well, this one's a little bit trickier because a PlayStation controller has X, circle, triangle, and square. Now, obviously, a Xbox controller has A, B, Y, and X. There's no such thing as a square. There's no such thing as a triangle. They're all very different in slightly different positions. But the actual position of the button is actually the most interesting part of this. Because with the new input system, thankfully, Rene has set up button east, north, south, and west. So this is indicating which one of those 4 directional buttons. In this case, I'm going to do button south, which is PlayStation controller X or cross, Xbox controller A, Nintendo Switch controller B. They've made it easy for us to get a little bit mixed up when setting up input. So thankfully, Rene has made it much, much easier for everyone. So now that we've got this all set up, I can hit Save Asset, and then this will work straight away. Now, we mentioned, before I jump into the editor, I'm also going to set up for the gamepad control scheme here, just by ticking that button. But we mentioned a little bit earlier on that you may have difficulty knowing what the references are, or perhaps debugging, what is a triangle, what is right trigger, and things like this. So if I now go to Window and go to Analysis, there's a new option that comes with the input system package called Input Debugger. If I open up this Input Debugger, what you'll notice is that it has a list of connected devices, in this case, keyboard and mouse. Now, if I plug in a PlayStation controller, which I'm going to do right now, notice that the list updates, and it's updated outside of play mode, which is super cool. It says DualShock 4 Gamepad, and I can actually double click this and open up this window just for this device. And this also works for mouse and keyboard and things like this. What you'll notice, actually, I'll make this a lot bigger so you can actually see the full list, is we've got all the different buttons to do with the PlayStation controller. And if I now open, and I'm going to have to tactically do this, if I now hold up the PlayStation controller, notice that as I push different buttons, this interface is basically going to, one sec. I need to probably make it a little bit smaller. Okay, basically you can see the values are actually updating as I push them, like right stick, left trigger. If I close this one for the PlayStation controller and open up, I don't know, keyboards and push keys on the keyboard, notice it's logging those. And we have all these keyboard keys. So for each device, it's going to have contextual settings or contextual values for basically that device. So you can actually test and simulate all the input debug stuff when you plug in a controller before you even use the input actions or before you even use any code. So now that I've got this PlayStation 4 controller plugged in, make sure that everything works in terms of the Warrior. So we've got the Warrior. We've got these different control schemes. So I'm now going to use a default scheme of gamepads. Now when I enter play mode, what's going to happen is this Warrior is now using PlayStation. He gains a very snazzy blue look. Not exactly Sony branding, but it's very close enough. The recoloring of the team colors is actually done with shader graph. So if you're watching this and you think, okay, this is cool, but I'm more interested in shader graph and VFX, you can even download this project and study that part if you want to. I've already set up the control map for you, including one for just the beard, which is kind of cool. But I digress. So if I now go back to this project, as I move this PlayStation controller around, I have to do this whilst I've got the webcam, notice that the character's moving. I can push X, and basically the character's now going to attack using X. And notice that I did that without actually changing anything in the code. All I did was just choose different bindings for these actions. And the other cool thing is you can also switch these at runtime. So you notice here that the debug controls are saying user 0 is using gamepads, it's using DualShock. Now if I push a key on the keyboard, it's going to switch to the keyboard. So I'm instantly switching between PlayStation controller and also keyboard on the fly. It's basically doing auto switching. So this is going to be really useful for a lot of people doing games on, say, Steam or other type of platforms, in game jams, in games with different types of gamepad support, where they're going to be able to support a wide range of different platforms and wide range of different inputs. So yeah, we have now got this. Now also, if I plug in an Xbox controller, so notice I can just plug in an Xbox controller. If I go to my device list, notice we got here Xbox controllers picked up. I've actually plugged in 2 Xbox controllers to show that when you plug in more than one of these devices, such as multiplayer of 4 Xbox controllers or 4 PlayStation controllers, it actually detects each of these. And I've got the Xbox controller here. I've plugged it in. Let me just retry that again. I've now got a Xbox One controller here, and it's working with the button south as well. So it works with X on PlayStation and now the south button, which is A on Xbox. So notice I just plugged an Xbox controller. I didn't actually change anything in the code. I didn't even resave this asset. It just worked because the general gamepad option is all set up for that. So that's pretty cool. That was a moment where I tried this and I said, yeah, I really wish I had this TARDIS time machine to go back in time and take Rene with me to all these projects I did in Unity 10 years ago. Yeah. So thank you, Rene. I've got a couple more fun things to show you. So now that we have multiple devices plugged in, PlayStation, Xbox One, and Xbox 2, what about having multiple warriors at runtime? What about multiple local multiplayer? This is a very common thing. A lot of people like to build and play, especially with Nintendo Switch having Joy-Cons and things like this. So in this example project, I've got a spawn multiplayers button. And basically, it's going to take this warrior prefab and spawn multiple instances of it, in this case, 3. So now if I hit play, and check that warrior, okay, and enter play mode. Okay, yeah, I forgot to assign the action asset. That was my fault. What you'll notice is it's now spawned 3 warriors with 1, 2, 3, getting that debug value. And I can now actually just spawn these warriors, run around. I need more hands to play this. And they're clearly not respecting social distancing here. I now have this PlayStation 1, Xbox One, and this is the same prefab spawn multiple times. It's not actually saying this is Xbox prefab, this is PlayStation prefab, and things like this. It's just the same warrior prefab spawned a couple of times. And just to prove this to you, in the game manager, I've got this spawn script, which is just a very bog standard instantiate players. And with the player input component, it's then automatically detecting a device and assigning it to it. And also at runtime, this input debug is very useful in showing the different types of users connected. So here we've got one of the user 0, and it's connected to a DualShock. So you can actually debug and test all this at runtime. You can see, oh, the Xbox controlled to this one or this one, and things like this. And just before I leave play mode, another thing I've added into this demo, and this was also a big pain, is actually disconnect and reconnect a controller. So if I take the PlayStation controller and unplug this, so it's now, the wire is unplugged, what you'll notice is that the UI is updated to controller disconnected. I've changed it to an X, and the character actually gains a white beard. It's just a simple aesthetic change. Note, that's because there's a callbacks in the system now on this on-device lost here, which basically you can then detect and pop-up menu say, hey, player 3 controller's run out of battery or disconnected or something like this. And then you can actually replug it back in, all in runtime. And hey, look, PlayStation controller is now working, and everything's working great again. So a lot of these little tools and little menu, little APIs and little things like this is really going to make it a lot easier for people to create games with different forms of input. And hopefully this project can be useful for people to kind of dissect and extract these chunks of code and these little examples. Now, before I pass it over to Rene and Will, there's one last thing I want to show you, and that's mobile. Because I knew some people ask about it, so I put that into the project as well. So here I have a UI input here of a little axis, a little joystick axis, and a little sword button. Now, a lot of people make mobile games, and one of the elements of mobile games for something like this is a virtual joystick and a virtual button. So this UI, which is using the Unity UI system, UGUI, has components that are compatible with it, which come with the input system. And at this opportune moment, my neighbor is now drilling, so that's great. And with these on-screen stick and with this on-screen button components that come with this, you can set up a control path. So for the on-screen stick, we can set up a control path which looks almost identical to, well, is identical to this properties bindings path. And here I'm going to choose Gamepad and left stick, because remember, we've already set up left stick to work with movement, so we might as well use this UI to work with it as well. And if I go to button, attack, we go to Gamepad, we do button south, it's going to kind of piggyback off of this Gamepad controls. So now, if I enter play mode, if I enter play mode and spawn, let's say 1 warrior, make sure that the prefab didn't have the, and wait, yep, go enter play mode here. Notice that when I move this little joystick here, it's basically simulating basically like a touchscreen. So I can click this little button to move around and move this little joystick to move around. And I can click this attack button as well to attack with the character. And if I now open up my phone, because I've already built this to Androids just to prove it doesn't just work or simulate the touch inputs on the in the editor. So I've already built this exact same project to device. So I've now got the warrior moving around with virtual joystick. and I've got tapping a button to attack, and he's got a nice purple. If you build it to a device and use the phone as a gamepad, he has a nice purple branding to it as well. I try to change the colors to be topical. So we've now got basically the same input system without having to hardwire different code working on a touchscreen device. And just to round off very quickly, I'm going to spawn 5 warriors with all the controls and inputs plugged in. And what this should do is it will basically spawn a different warrior for each of these input devices that I've shown you. So we've now got one for the keyboard, which is currently active, one for one Xbox controller, one for the other Xbox controller, one for the PlayStation controller, and also one for this on-screen UI. So just using that one prefab, spawning those instances, all the devices plugged into this machine can piggyback off of it. It also works with the Nintendo Switch Pro controller and probably lots of other gamepads, but I need to borrow a lot more gamepads, a lot more hands, and ask my roommates to help me, because juggling all these controllers and wires is a lot of fun, right? So yeah, hopefully this demo was useful in sort of giving an overview of the project, giving over the project, giving over the input system. There's lots of other fun stuff. So I actually implemented a pause menu to show that you can actually rebind different buttons to different things. So I can rebind the PlayStation controllers cross to R1, and then I can hit R1 and it will basically attack. So you can actually download this project. There's lots of really nice little tools and things that you can learn from and play with. And I'm going to look into extending more of it in the future. So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and pass it back over.
Before you jump out of screen share real quick, would you mind showing us the listen button? I'm not sure if we covered that in this, as in the listen for input.
I did show it briefly, but I can show it again.
It's just something that always comes up as people wanting to quickly find the input that they're pressing. I know the analysis tool that we show obviously shows you that you are, or sort of confirms that you're getting input. I think it's always useful to remind people that they can click on the listen button if they want to just hold up a gamepad and press something to assign it.
Yeah, sure. So I'll share my screen again. So I'm sharing my screen again. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to, we'll leave play mode. I'm going to go to this attack. I'm going to add another binding. And when I click here on this path, obviously, yeah, you could go through this list, and we could do a 10-hour webinar where I go through every single option and ask Rene for lots of help, because some of these ones I haven't even played with yet, such as pen or the XR stuff. But we have this little listen button. So if I click listen, it's going to say listening for input. So if I now, for example, push Xbox controller like R1 or the shoulder, notice it's automatically detected R1 for the PS4 controller or right shoulder for gamepad. Now, I could choose R1 if it's going to just be, say, a PlayStation game. But let's say, for example, we want it to also work with Xbox controller, which also has a shoulder button, or a Switch Pro controller, as it also has a shoulder. I can then choose that. This also works if I say, like joystick. So if I just wobble the left stick, it's going to show all the different forms of left stick that it could filter to. It also works if I say push like a keyboard key. So let's do, we really want to bind something to, I know, enter. Oh, no, not enter. Let's choose something that's not going to move to like.
I think you're in the search. There you go.
Yeah, sorry. Control. So notice it's picked up control, right control, or any key on the keyboard. So listen's super handy to not go menu hunting, but instead, filter to what you want. Kind of like shader graph, you can type in, color, and it will pop up all the color related ones. It's similar, but also handy, especially if you have a controller. I mean, people are used to PlayStation, Xbox controllers at this point, but there's a lot of new controllers on the market, which people get wrapping their head around. And if they want to understand what the terminology or the geography is of the controllers, then the listens can be super handy for that.
Yeah, and worth kind of reinforcing that when Andy's showing you there the gamepad versus PS4 or versus Xbox controller, that is that generic binding that will work for all controllers. So
like I myself, I'm working on a game where I want to support Xbox pad and PlayStation pad at the same time, because I don't know what my playtesters might happen to have, or even 360 pads. Then I use their gamepad binding because I want it to just work for all of them. But if you are working maybe on a console game specifically only ever going to be on PS4, then you might choose that specific binding.
And I guess some people are going to filter it a little bit more, because obviously the Switch has plus and minus buttons for various options, like minus on, I think it's minus on Animal Crossing opens up pause menu, right? So maybe you're making a game, you want to utilize plus or minus for camera zoom. I don't know. They could be anything. Whereas obviously PlayStation has a share button. So you can obviously filter it to be more specific, but you can also be very general. Yeah, the choice is there. Yeah.
Awesome.
I guess one thing, I'll jump over to Google Chrome now. So I've got a GitHub repo. So this repo is actually public and live now, and I think it's in a slide will show, or will has maybe. Yep. And I've got the project here with masters 19.3, branch is 2020.1. And I've also tried to write like kind of a bit of a project overview with lots of information, usage. You can download the project, learn from it, use the tools, learn from how, I don't know, shader graph set up or the input system, or kind of a bit of anything. You can also build on top of it in your own projects. If you see it and you think, oh, great, I'm making a game with warrior Vikings that run around in a very open, boring, matrixy environment, then this is going to be perfect. Or if you want to extract code and you think, oh, I probably want to rewrite most of that, but I really like the text floating above the characters' heads, then you can use that as well. It's really up to you. So you can feel free to dive in and go to this repo and open up issues, and I'll have a look at the issues, and I'll fix things and look into how I can extend it and make it better in the future and things like that. I'll stop sharing because obviously running out of time.
Thanks, Andy. So that's fantastic demo. For those of you who want to pick up the demo, we've put the link into the chat, but if you're watching this after the fact, you can use this handy link. So I'm just going to present and then quickly just share that link. So if you look on the screen now, you can go to on.unity.com/input system warriors, and that's a quick link to get to Andy's GitHub repo. But without further ado, let's jump into some of the questions that have been kind of flooding in through Zoom Q&A. If you are watching this after the fact, just a reminder that there's a dedicated forum for this. So you can use the link on the screen, on.unity.com/input_system, to get to the forum easily. So we're just going to take the live questions for now. We'll be answering things on the forum later. So I'm going to unshare real quick. Okay, so Rene, where would you like to start with all of these questions? We have a really good amount of questions. Some of them are similar. Is there anything that's caught your eye so far?
Oh, by the way, I don't think the link was visible. I don't think.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just going to put that on the screen one more time. Maybe I didn't complete my screen share properly.
Oh yeah, now it's visible. Oh yeah, and there's the links. Cool.
Okay, here's the links. Sorry about that, everyone. Meanwhile, we'll look at the questions on our other monitors. So yeah, Rene, where would you like to start?
I mean, unfortunately, with the time we have left, we probably will only get to a fraction. But yeah, like you said, like there's a forum section and there's a thread in there where we will, like whatever is asked here, we will answer there, whatever we don't get to. But yeah, otherwise, like, okay, one thing that has come up repeatedly, dots. Will we support dots? Yes. Basically, in terms of roadmap, the three biggest next items we have is improvements to the action stuff. There's things like having routed input, basically where an action that consumes, for example, Shift B can prevent an action that consumes just B from triggering, that kind of thing. Then we have gestures, really big thing. Like right now our touch support is very basic. We want to flesh that out a whole lot more. And then third item, I mean, I mentioned it last, but that doesn't mean that this is the least important, not at all. Dot support, like specialized support for dots, where you no longer have to restrict yourself to main thread only APIs and Unity.engine, Unity Engine DLL. We will work on that pretty soon.
Cool. Another one I've seen come in a few times asking about Joy-Cons versus the Nintendo Switch controller. What's the status there?
Right now, we support the Joy-Cons and the Switch Pro controller with a full feature set only on Switch. So you need to have the console-specific package. We do support the Switch Pro controller, but without motion sensors on Mac and Windows, I think. But not the Joy-Cons. It's on the list. We have to see there. It's not a known documented format that Nintendo wants other people to pick up. So we have to see. We may not be able to support them with the motion sensors. We'll see, but it's on the list.
Cool. Let me see what else have we got here. Tap versus double tap versus hold ? Key combos. JJ is asking that question.
Key combos or touch? What was the?
Well, they're talking about, like, you know, if you're chaining together certain things, like how would someone go about that?
Oh, right. So we have a model in there for interactions, which includes double taps, taps, slow taps, that kind of thing. It's extensible, so you can write your own interactions and add them to the system. They work just as native as the stuff that we write ourselves. And there is the composite stuff that Andy showed. It's also an extensible system. You can write your own composites. There are some composites in there that we supply that also has something for doing Shift B or Shift Control B and that stuff. We plan on extending both. Like right now, for example, you have the problem if you want to have a binding for Shift B and B on two different actions, both will trigger as soon as you press Shift B. As I said before, that's something that is on the short list of things that we want to get to next.
Great. Another one I've seen come in. So David Antonioli asked, what considerations are involved in deciding between the input callback styles, send message, Unity events? It's just a matter of preference, or are there technical considerations?
There are. Like the message stuff is really good for prototyping. Like it has zero setup. It's super quick, but it's not efficient. Like especially the first call, like Unity has to do some really expensive looking up there. It does some caching internally, but still it's a very slow path that, like in production settings, is usually good to avoid. But for game jam stuff and this kind of thing, it's perfect. In general, I would recommend going with Unity events. They stay entirely on the managed side. They have a pretty low performance overhead. Yeah.
Cool. An interesting one from, where was it? From just R, the mysterious R. Will there be support for input systems like hand tracking, eye gaze, or external interfaces like tap, etc.? I think that's two questions in one, really.
Hand tracking and stuff. Like that. Well, there's definitely movement in the XR space to build out tracking to become ever more fine-grained. I mean, if you look at Index, I mean, we're already getting to a point where it becomes much more articulate, and we will see that increasing. So we will get much more tracking data, much more fine-grained. And I expect that ultimately we will have full hand models and probably more than just that, ARM models as well and that kind of stuff. And yes, I expect that to be fully integrated.
So it's not something that works now, but am I right in thinking we'll probably make that available as part of the XR interaction toolkit at a later date at some point, right?
Yes, and the low-level inputs, they will probably surface at the input system level. I mean, we already support some, I'm not sure about index support specifically, but I know that, for example, the Oculus Touch controller has near touches and that kind of stuff. We expose all that kind of stuff, and yeah, this will only continue.
Cool, thank you. There's one from Lee Perry, says, I think we kind of already answered this with Andy's example of 5, but he says, does this system work with direct input game controllers for games supporting more than 4 controllers? I'm currently supporting 10 local players in my game.
So we don't have support for direct input, but we have support for HID in general. So if you're looking at X input controllers, no, we only support 4 because we're picking up that with the X input API, and that is limited to just 4 controllers. As far as HIDs are concerned, like the DualShock controller and any other gamepad, we support arbitrary many, so there's no limitation there. And for X input, like I expect that in sometime in the future when we merge the UWP code base more with the classic Win32 code base, we will hopefully also get rid of the limit there for X input controllers.
Right, cool. Interesting question from Philip, who asks, is there any emulator of PS4 or Xbox gamepads? We don't even have a real one for testing. So we don't have that kind of functionality, but I think the answer to that is either obviously to get one, but I wonder if it's something that you would consider, Rene, as something that we would have in a similar way to how Device Simulator sort of provides emulation for people without phone handsets.
And there's 2 things that you can basically already do out of the box. Like you can build your custom gamepad as on-screen controls. Basically like Andy did there, you can just create a gamepad basically with couple of buttons on screen and 2 sticks and control your game with that and use that for testing. And then like we have like extensive automation support where like you can make up any kind of device input. So you can write your own code that, for example, for automated testing or even for manual testing, just creates an artificial gamepad and routes input into the system in however you see fit.
Cool. I'm just scanning the rest of the questions.
I'm going through and trying to answer them as well, because I think the answers are then recorded somewhere and shared afterwards. Yep.
Console support, see the question in there, yes, but there are specific packages because of NDA reasons that you need to grab from the licensing specific forum sections and install them for the specific platform, like Xbox, PS4, and Switch. So you need a license for the respective console.
Yeah, so if you have a contact at any of the vendors, then they'll be able to hook you up with that package directly.
Yes. See, migration, like a migration guide, like we still have to catch up even on the migration guide from our old input system. As far as migration from other solutions, I don't see us doing that. Also, especially with the asset store packages, because we don't really want to compete with our own asset store vendors. But migration guide, like a more useful one that we have for our old input system, that will definitely happen.
Cool. And someone else asked if there will be tutorials. So as I understand it from our Learn team, they're going to be using the new input system in some of their new projects over the next couple of months. So look forward to that being implemented there. Someone else asked, I've lost track, there's quite a few questions here, what method they'd be using in those, but I don't know those projects intimately enough these days. So I'm afraid I can't tell you about that. Electric Shock asks, can you please post what your YouTube channel is with a URL if possible? So if you go to google.com and type in Unity YouTube, you'll get that. Blah, blah, blah. How about VR and AR inputs? Well, like we said, there's some support for that. And then if you do have a look on Package Manager, you'll see there's a separate package coming out for that purpose. It's called XR Interaction Toolkit. And it basically aims to give you a bunch of prefabs and ready-made rigs for controls for XR.
Looks like we're gonna that we will have to wrap up.
Yes, we will, absolutely. So I'm just going to finish by putting the links back on the screen, but thanks to everyone for coming. Andy, thank you so much for the demo, and Rene for making an amazing input system. So I'm just going to present and we'll close out on the screen with the links. Thanks to everyone for attending, and we'll see you on the next Unite Now.
Thank you, everyone.